jive with what you're saying. Wonderful. Oh, my goodness. And if you'd rather not say it in public, then let me know, because I think we all have an obligation to help each other grow, right? So if you see a spot I've missed, I would consider it a astonishing privilege if you would say, I disagree with you. And then I'll say, wonderful, wonderful, here's an opportunity to grow. Tell me why, and tell me what. And then you'll say this, and I'll go, okay, that's fantastic. What's the evidence for that? And then I'll say, well, here's the evidence for what I'm thinking. Let's study together. Let's grow together. Let's grow in the Lord. Isn't that what we need to do? Because I am the world's expert, as I've said before a few times, in one thing, and that is my opinion. But I've learned over the years that my opinion sometimes is not so reliable. And so do please comment, let me know what you think, whatever. Now, let's kind of set the stage. Acts chapter 4. Now, of course, as we know, these chapter divisions and verse divisions are modern, relatively modern, artificial constructs of people. Good-natured people, helpful people, but I was just talking to someone not too long ago, and they were having some difficulty because the verses were chopping up the way they were thinking about something. And I said, oh, remember that for the first 1,000 years, 1,200 years, there were no chapter divisions. They had this beautiful, free-flowing text. So you could engage with it, you could see the flow of the text, and the writers are writing that way so you can see the flow of the argument. It's never just a little chunk, it's the flow of the argument. And then for the first, it wasn't until like 1,500 years after Jesus that we had verse divisions. When a French publisher, Stephanus, was publishing a new Greek New Testament, he thought it would be really cool and very helpful if he would break up the text into verses. And it is a wonderful tool. It's a wonderful GPS locator. So Charles can tell me, hey, look over here in so-and-so book. Okay, in the old days, he would have to say, kind of like in the middle, a little bit after this episode and just before this is being talked about. And I would go, okay. And I'd have to dig through. But now you could say, go to 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 5, GPS. But as soon as we get there, we got to throw that out of our head and just try to think about flowing argument and text. It's not too hard to do. It just takes some practice. It took me a while to get that in my head, that it's not just verses. You let me cherry pick verses, I can prove anything. But if you force me to use the context, which we should be using, then I can't prove things that aren't in the text. So let's do our location. We're there. Now, let's set the stage a little bit, because I think also we need to be like newspaper reporters back in the day, when newspapers were king, and they would train their young reporters, don't you bring back a story to the chief editor unless you've covered the 5 W's. And they would drill this in their head. And if this young newspaper reporter brought back something without all 5 of the 5 W's, they would chastise them vigorously and send them back out. The 5 W's, who, what, where, when, why. Very important in the story. Very important in the narrative. Who, what, where, when, why. Same for us. Who is speaking? It makes a big difference. Who is being spoken to makes a big difference. When? What's going on? What's been happening lately? Oh, Jesus said this in response to what? Luke 14, parable of the wedding feast. He saw the people there that were jockeying for the best seat around this feast that the Pharisee was given. Upon seeing that, he thought, this is a teaching moment. I need to teach these guys something. And then we have the beautiful parable of the wedding feast, etc. Sometimes even where makes a gigantic difference. Where was this happening? Why, for example, did Jesus do this kind of odd detour up into Gentile territory? Because he always stayed in Jewish territory, but this time he did this odd detour up into Caesarea Philippi, named after Caesar and King Philip, both. So Caesarea Philippi. Why? There's a very critical geopolitical reason he took them there. It makes a tremendous difference, etc. So those 5 W's are really important. Let's set the stage, because these are real people and real things are happening to them. Just think, they had worries and concerns and trying to make money to pay the rent and feed the kids just like we do today. Now, of course, their culture was quite a bit different, but the basics of the people were there, real people. We know some of the names. We'll see some of the names in the book of Acts. Others, we don't know the names. But this is real life, real people. So let's set the stage very, very briefly. We saw in Acts chapter 1 that Jesus arose. He arose and he told the people, his disciples, these 140 that were gathered together, 140, to stay in Jerusalem because something is going to happen in 50 days, what we call Pentecost, what the Hebrews would call Shavuot, because there's three big pilgrimage festivals for the Jews. Passover, which they would call Pesach, to celebrate the release of the Jews from bondage, 400 years approximately of bondage in Egypt. So they would remember that and celebrate that. And then 50 days later, they would have Shavuot, which we call, what do we call that? Pentecost, right? The 50. To celebrate Moses bringing down the Ten Commandments, the law of Moses, which was a pivotal event in Hebrew history. And so they would celebrate it. And then later in the fall, they would have Sukkot, which we would call, what, Festival of Tabernacles, I believe in the King James Version, Festival of Booths, where each family would build some kind of rickety tent, shelter, and they would have all their meals in it for like a week or so to remember the difficulties of their ancestors in the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness when they had to live in temporary tents. And so during these pilgrimage festivals, people from all over the area would swarm into Jerusalem, especially for Passover and especially for Pentecost, a little bit less for Festival of Booths. So in Pentecost, there's still a lot of visitors coming in. So the population of Jerusalem would swell to a gigantic number during that time. So now during this time, they hear this rushing gigantic noise like a hurricane, I guess, or a tornado. Luke doesn't really describe it much except just this wind kind of sound. And they run over to where this is coming from, and they see these apostles, and they're giving a message, and we know they can hear it in their own language, each person in their own language. It's astonishing. And many people are convinced by Peter's fantastic flowing argument that Jesus is the one that you Jews, us Jews, because all the disciples are Jews, Jesus is Jews, all the early Christians are Jews, that you've been waiting for all of your life, and here he is. And in fact, you and your leaders killed him. Can you imagine how that would feel if you were a Jew in all your life? Grandma, grandpa, mom, dad, great-grandma, great-grandpa have been telling you all your life, one day the Mashiach will be here. The Messiah will come, and everything will be okay. Now, we know a lot of those folks kind of had this idea that the Messiah would come like on a giant white horse and ride up to the temple in Jerusalem, and the chief priest would come out and acknowledge him as the Messiah, and then every Jew would flow into Jerusalem, and they would mount a grand army and defeat the Romans and kick them out and reestablish the glory of the kingdom of David and the kingdom of Solomon. And this would be the glory of God on earth again. But this itinerant rabbi, Jesus, who said, I am the one, but it was all a spiritual thing, wasn't it? He said, my kingdom is not of this world. But it's really hard to grasp, and I can imagine that. I have a lot of sympathy with those guys, really I do. You know, sometimes I think, hey, if I'd seen these miracles, man, I wouldn't have doubted. I don't know. I'm pretty hard-headed. So I'm not just really so terribly sure if that would be the case. But nevertheless, we know thousands of people are convinced that these Jews, 3,000. Acts 2, this beautiful Acts 2. And so if we flow through Acts 2, we see Peter's beautiful sermon. He convicts these people that they did this, and they say, tell us what to do. And he said, I can tell you what to do. Repent, turn, change your mind, have a new mind, recreate your mind, think differently. And then he said, and every one of you, let, a subjunctive form, let yourself be baptized. In other words, get baptized. Now, interestingly, I think, is if we look down in the bottom of chapter 2, we see something that these new Jewish Christians are doing. And it's beautiful, isn't it? And day by day, they attended the temple together. And they broke bread, which is just a figure of speech in this form for eating. Now, there's another beautiful figure of speech in the New Testament, the breaking of the bread, using the definite article, the, which means Lord's Supper, communion. But breaking bread just means eating. Breaking of the bread, very specific, communion, in their homes. So notice, for some reason I thought for a long time, for no particular reason, I don't really know why, but I kind of thought, day of Pentecost, boom, all the Jews magically became modern American Christians. And they stopped doing everything that they thought was holy and in honor of God. They started eating pork and things like this. And what's wrong with my head? This is crazy. No, they were Jews. So where do Jews go? To the holiest place they know? They run to the temple. Of course they do. So they're worshiping the temple, but the key is day by day, every day they're together. And remember, nobody had anything that they considered their own. Everything was in common. Well, of course, all these foreigners are in Jerusalem. Their homes are goodness knows where. They don't have anything. They don't have clothes, they don't have food, they don't have a place to stay. But that was no worry with these early converts. They said, hey, don't worry about that. You can't travel back to Bethlehem. You can't travel back to Galilee. You're here for this pilgrimage festival. Don't worry, we got your back. We got you covered. Don't worry. No worries. You don't need a hotel. You don't need extra money to buy food. Hey, come into my house. Welcome. It's just so beautiful. And then in Acts chapter 3, we see it again. Now, Peter and John were going up to the temple at 3 in the afternoon, at the typical hour of prayer. Of course they are. They're going to worship at the temple. But they're also teaching in the temple and saying, proving that this Jesus is the Messiah. And even more and more Jews are getting in this mind of thought. And then in chapter 4, though, trouble starts to arise. They're in the temple. There are thousands of these new converts. They're in the temple, and the chief priest, the Sanhedrin court, the religious authorities that are supposed to be respected, and you're supposed to listen to what I tell you is religious. I'm the chief priest. I'm the Sadducee council. I'm the Supreme Court, the Sanhedrin council, the 70 plus 1 that rules the people. Listen to what I say, and I tell you this rabbi is blaspheming. This rabbi, Jesus, is blaspheming. So how long is this interaction going to last where these new Christian converts, and we have to remember they were not called Christians until way later, these new Messianic Jews in the temple that believed almost exactly, not the opposite, but very differently from the established temple authorities. What's going to happen? The guys with the army is going to go kick them out of the temple. And that is exactly what they did. So we see that here the captain of the temple came in and said, oh, no, you're causing too much trouble. We don't like this. And so the captain of the temple comes in, and they were greatly annoyed. Now that's an understatement. The Greek word that Luke used here means really distressed and grievously distressed and just beside themselves. I'm trying to think of a modern English word that we could drop in there, and I can't really think of one that's powerful enough. They were really beside themselves because they were teaching the people, and they were proclaiming this rabbi, Yeshua, this Jesus, was the Messiah. Now, of course, the people that believe this, I just can't imagine how excited they were. They've been waiting for this all their life. Has anybody seen Fiddler on the Roof, that wonderful movie back in like 71, 2, 3? Seen that? Where it's a story about this Jewish community in Anatevka, Russia, when the Russian authorities decided we don't like Jews anymore, and they sent the soldiers in and they kicked them out of their homes. They had to leave like now with the clothes on their back. And that was it. Fiddler on the Roof, and that's what the story's about. And part of that story I still remember. One of the just average people, he was a tailor named Motel. And he saw the rabbi of the village coming down, the teacher of the village, and he said, Rabbi, we've been waiting for the Messiah all of our lives. Wouldn't this be a great time for him to come? And the rabbi said, well, we'll just have to wait for him somewhere else. So, of course, the people in this Fiddler on the Roof story don't believe that Jesus is the Messiah, just like a lot of people back 2,000 years previously did not believe. But the ones that did believe, I just can't imagine the excitement. No wonder they ran home and said, he's here. Who? The Mashiach, the Messiah, the one that's been prophesied for centuries, that Grandma and Grandpa told us about, Mom and Dad told us about, great-grandma and Grandpa told us about. He's here. Oh my goodness, what's going to happen? Is it going to be an army? What's going to happen? Are we going to kick out the Romans? What is it? Oh, I just can't even imagine. It just gives me goosebumps to think about it. So the rulers and the powers of the temple basically arrested them, beat them up, threw them in jail, and said, don't you do this no more. And as soon as they got out, what did they do? They just keep on doing it, right? And finally it gets so bad. And then later in Acts we'll see this very devout Jew, Pharisee of the tribe of Benjamin, very devout, very serious. And he finally went to the Supreme Court, the Sanhedrin Council, and he said, we cannot let these blaspheming Jesus people keep doing this. It's blasphemy. It's against God. So I want you to give me kind of like a badge, deputize me, give me the civil power to go arrest people, beat them up, throw them in jail, whatever, and I will wipe these guys out. Now we know that guy's name was Shaul in Hebrew. We say Saul, right? It's kind of been morphed over the many years into modern English. And then he had this amazing conversion on the road as he was going to Damascus to beat up some more Christians. And Jesus appeared to him and said, Shaul, why are you persecuting me? And he said, who are you? And he said, I am Jesus, the one you're persecuting. Stop it. And we don't know what else happened. We just had that little brief snippet from Luke. I wonder what else happened, but we're not privy to that. But it changed him so much that he said, from now on, I'm going to go by my Roman name, Paul. And now he became the so-called self-proclaimed apostle to the Gentiles. And now we have the Gentiles, us, at least me. I don't think I have any direct Jewish heritage grafted in place. So we see that they had everything in common. Now this is one of those, headers that are put in by the editors, so we have to kind of take this with a grain of salt, just like we have to take with a grain of salt the verse breaks and the chapter breaks, but sometimes it's helpful, sometimes it's terrible. Oh, here's a good example of a terrible one. If we popped over to Luke 15, we have this beautiful construct that Luke builds for us. It's beautiful, and it's meant to be read together in a flowing unit. And that's what we call chapter 15. Let's call it GPS location 1.5. And just to remind ourselves, that's totally arbitrary. But in that section, Luke does this back-to-back-to-back set of 3 parables. Parable of the lost sheep. There was a man who had 100 sheep, and one got lost. What did he do? He went and left the others and found that one guy. The next, immediately after, we have the parable of the lady who lost a coin, the parable of the lost coin. And then next we have the parable of, what? You guys tell me. What's the parable? The prodigal son, right? That is the most worthless header that I've ever seen in my life, but it's one that we've inherited. It's one that people several hundred years ago decided was wonderful, and they put it in for us. Prodigal, wasteful. Is that what the parable is about? The parable, the story of the wasteful son? Is that what the parable is about? But see, we've inherited that, and so we think it's like real, and so we use it. It's just somebody made it up. They thought it was cool. But I would say, no, it's not the wastefulness of the son. It's the parable of the lost son. Parable of the lost sheep, parable of the lost coin, parable of the lost son. That's what it's about, the lost and found son, the lost and found coin, the lost and found sheep. It's not the wasteful son. That's part of the story that carries the message. But see, we've inherited these and we use them. But as long as we use them carefully, we realize that the chapter breaks and the verses are just artificial breaks, and we use it as a tool to get to the location. And as soon as we get to the GPS location, we quickly disperse it from our mind and look for the flow, look for the argument, look for the context. It's beautiful. These writers were so amazing. It's amazing when you see the flow, especially with Paul, and especially with Luke. I'm a big fan of Luke. Very wonderful logical flow. Luke the physician, as Paul calls him in the letter to the Colossians, the beloved physician.
And I think that's probably right, because a lot of times Luke will use the medical term for something. In fact, we'll see one today, actually, that he uses the medical term. All right, so the key is, though, that these Jews, boom, the Messiah is here. They don't stop being Jews like I was kind of thinking they were. No, they're Jews, but now we might say they're Jews who realize the culmination, the completion of the promise of God, way back to Abraham, way back to Moses, the promise of the Messiah. And they realize, here it is. Here it is. So really, this is not a new deal, even though we call it the New Testament. I understand that. You know, that's what we call it. That's our culture. It's the culmination of the deal, the promise. There's just one promise, one flowing promise to the Messiah. Now, understanding has changed. Oh, yes. And Gentiles have been grafted in, thank God. And here we are. But it's one beautiful, beautiful plan. To understand the whole plan, that's why I think it's so important that we study in also the Old Testament, as we call it, because that's the beginning of the plan. It's critical that we study the New Testament because that's the culmination of the plan. It's beautiful. It's fantastic. Okay. Now, let's engage in our text of the day, which we're really going to look at chapter 5, this very interesting story of the people that we know, Ananias and Sapphira, right, that we call them, Ananias and Sapphira, right? Ananias and Sapphira. By the way, it's kind of so tragic, really, when we think about it. That very name, Ananias, is from the Hebrew root chana, which means graciousness. So his name basically means God is gracious. God is a gracious gift, something like that. Sapphira kind of means like beautiful or jewel, sapphire, kind of like. But Ananias' name, God is gracious. And what's he going to do? He's going to get in trouble. But let's look at 4. We got to set the stage. Here's a terrible example. Here's an excellent example of a terrible chapter break that Archbishop Langton of the Church of England decided was a good place to break the chapter. Some are good, some are terrible. Here's an example of a bad one. Because really, the story, the narrative, this happening, this historical happening, we need to back up in what we call chapter 4. So let's look at this in verse 32, location 32, artificial verse break, but there it is. So the number of those who believed, and notice this Hebrew way of thinking and speaking, where things are expressed in pictures that you can see, hear, taste, touch, not very abstract like modern American, modern Western culture. Heart. They have one heart and one soul. See, they're using very Hebraic speech. Of course they were. These are Hebrews. Of course they are. But we can interpret that today and say, you know what? They were just like one people. They were all together. Everybody had everybody else's back. Everybody was putting everybody else's needs just a little bit above their own needs. But then everybody else was putting their needs a little bit below my needs. Can you imagine how that would be today if every person in the body of Christ, the church, if every person decided, you know, from henceforth, I'm going to put my needs just a little bit below everybody else's. But I know everybody else is putting my needs a little bit above theirs. I can barely imagine it. What would happen if that was our real, true, new creature mind of thinking? I just cannot wrap my brain around it. It's so against human, worldly nature that we've inherited. I just have trouble wrapping my head around that idea. Now, I think about it all the time. There's a hyperbolic expression, right? Not all the time, but frequently. I think about it and I go, I still don't quite understand how that could be. But that was what was supposed to be. And that was apparently what these guys did. Isn't that astonishing? And nobody said that anything they had belonged to himself only, but rather they shared everything, using this Greek word koinonion, sharing. Everything was shared. Everything was shared. Now, sometimes we get kind of off an odd track and we say, so, early Christians were communist. It's like a very abstract kind of idea, yeah, kind of. But remember, communist theory says everything you have belongs to me, the state. That's communism. Everything you have belongs to me, the state, the state. That's not what's going on here. This is sharing for everybody, everybody. Person, person, person. Totally not communism, at least the way we understand it. And so the apostles were there, and verse 34 says, you know, in fact, Luke says, if you allow me to paraphrase a bit, there was not even one person around that lacked anything. In fact, many people were owners of property, lands and houses, as Luke states, and this, by the way, is from the ESV. So still my favorite, very literal version. Otherwise, we could use a wonderful King James, New King James, very literal version. Number of others, ASV would be fantastic. And they brought the proceeds of what was sold, and they laid it down at the apostles' feet. And so everybody got whatever stuff they needed. There it is. Now, here's really the beginning of the story that is broken. This should go in, if we insist on chapters, this should be the beginning of the next chapter, in my humble opinion. So here's where we begin. So, Joseph, this guy, Joseph, who was also called by the apostles Barnabas, which means, Luke even gives us the definition. This is great. Luke decided to give his readers the definition, which means son of encouragement. Now, people have freaked out for many, many years, and they go, wait, that doesn't mean son of encouragement. The Greek word here is from the Greek word paraclete, encourager. So bar, yes, that does indeed mean son. That's the Aramaic root that means son. Simon bar Jonah. Simon, son of Jonah, bar. Okay, that means son. But Abbas, Nabas, that doesn't mean paraclete. So no, something's wrong here. You know, this Luke is either wrong or the Bible's wrong. But actually, I spent some time looking into this, knowing a bit about Luke. I did my graduate work in Luke. It's fantastic. He doesn't say things unless they need to be said. So it turns out that if you dig just a little bit deeper, you discover the Hebrew, remember these are all Hebrews, these are all Jews, the Hebrew word nabah, which we would transliterate in English as N-A-B-A, nabah. So bar, nabah. You put on the Greek nominative ending in writing Greek, which would be S for a name, so bar nabas. It makes total sense. And nabah means causing to bubble forth, like chatty, talking. So when I think about this, bar nabah, it's a good nickname. It means, have you ever known a person that somebody will say, you know, you just can't get that person down, right? They're always so positive. There's always bubbling over with positivity. I think that's what bar nabah means. This guy, he's like, you just can't get him down. You're just around him, and you just feel lifted up a little bit. It's just wonderful. So this guy, Joseph, who had the nickname Barnabas, which means son of encouragement, he was a Levite. He lived on the island of Cyprus, so he sold a field that belonged to him, and he brought the money and laid it at the apostles' feet. Now Luke is the master of contrast. And so now we're going to see the total contrast of what Barnabas did. And this is why it doesn't need to be in the next chapter. It really needs to be part of the flow. And so if we go to the next chapter, which we call chapter 5, then we see, here's our little connection. But, however, now, however you want to translate it, there was a man named Ananias, right? Graceful, God is grace. Ananias. And he had his wife named Sapphira, jewel, beautiful, whatever. And they sold a piece of property, okay, just like Barnabas did. Cool. And with the knowledge of his wife, he kept back. Now this is interesting. Kept back for himself. So here are 4 words that the translators thought were important to translate one Greek word that Luke used. Because the Greek word that Luke used was, it's nophizo, one Greek word. But the translators doing the ESV, just like the King James, etc., said, wow, there's no equivalent word really in English for that, so we need to put extra words to bring the meaning. But actually I think there is. If we look at other places that Greek word is used, nophizo here, it means embezzled. That's far better. Pilfered, swiped, absconded with. That's really what it means. Achan, you remember Achan back in Joshua 7, where they went to Jericho and they weren't supposed to take nothing. Because that's not for you guys, that's for God. Don't take nothing. But Achan stole some stuff, buried some silver under the dirt of his tent, and it caused a big mess, and Achan and his guys had to pay for it. Same word used in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, nosphizo. He embezzled. He stole it. He pilfered it. This is pretty strong language. So held back for himself is not very strong in English. So this is pretty strong. He knows full well that this is promised to God. Apparently he's already done a public promise, and then he lies about it, and then he steals from God. He embezzles from God. Oh my goodness. This is terrible. But he lays it at the apostles' feet, and Peter says, Ananias, why has the adversary, using that Hebrew word Satan, adversary, we just say Satan, right? The adversary, the opponent. Why has he filled your heart? There's another one of those beautiful Hebraic ideas of making things in pictures that you can see. Filled your heart to lie to the Holy Spirit and to embezzle part of the proceeds of the land you sold. Wow, that's pretty severe, isn't it? That's astonishingly severe. What's Ananias going to say? Luke doesn't say. Maybe he couldn't say anything. I don't know. And then Peter continues and he says, look, let me paraphrase. Before you sold it, didn't it just belong to you? And this is a rhetorical question. Of course, the answer is yes. And even after you sold it, wasn't the money yours? And of course, the rhetorical question answers yes. It's kind of like, Ananias, what is wrong with you? It's your land. You could do with it what you want. You know, you're not obligated to sell all you own and give it to the Lord. This is voluntary. But you lied about it. Why did you lie? And then now Peter reemphasizes that lie again. Why is it that you have decided, developed this plan? This is not some slip of the tongue. This is a plan. You have contrived to do this deed in your heart. So you haven't lied to people, but to God. And then now, amazingly in our story, when Ananias heard these words, he dropped dead. Now, once again, in this beautiful Hebraic way of writing in picture language, he fell down and breathed his last. But it's very poetic, isn't it? It's very, the way they say things, very poetic. And great fear, you could translate that respect, that would be okay. That might not be quite strong enough in this context, so maybe fear is a better word. And so great fear came upon everybody that saw this, heard this, and so the young man got up, wrapped Ananias in probably like a linen cloth, as was their custom, and hightailed it out and buried him right away. Very fast. You know, typically they'd have a little waiting period. You'd like to bury him the same day, but you have a ceremony and some stuff. So this apparently was less than 3 hours. Because 3 hours later, Luke tells us, after about 3 hours, in verse 7, Sapphira came in. And she didn't know what had happened, and so Peter said to her, and now we have the story unfolding. Sapphira, if you allow me to paraphrase a bit, did you really sell that land for, let's just make up a number, $100,000? Which is what Ananias said, but really they sold it for, $150,000 or something like that. He embezzled. No, it's fees though. He embezzled that. Did you really sell it for 100, like Ananias told us? And then what did she say? Amazingly, it's almost like Peter gave her a chance to think about this for a second and to kind of repent from it on the fly and say, well, not really, because we had to put a new roof on our house, and so we needed some money, and so, yeah, we sold it for $150K. We kept 50 because we really needed that 50. So, yeah, you're right. And so we decided to give 100. But we said we sold it for a total of 100. But no, she didn't. She said, yes, absolutely. That's exactly what we did for so much. But Peter said to her, how is it that you two, Ananias and yourself, have agreed to test the Spirit of the Lord? And then painting another beautiful Hebraic style picture, he says, look, the feet of the guys that just buried your hubby are waiting for you because now it's your turn. And so immediately, she fell down and breathed her last. And so the young men came in, she was dead, they carried her out, buried her beside her hubby. Now let's stop there for a second. It's a very interesting historical narrative, tells us what happened. But so what? What is the reason the message is there for us today? What are we supposed to glean from this message? So help me out. I got like 3 or 4 ideas, all of which are probably partially bogus. What do you guys think? What pops into your head when you read this story for today, for us today? Now, the apostles are not here. We cannot bring in, money and lay it at the apostles' feet and tell everybody this is every penny that I've got, every penny I sold it for. So today, what does it mean? Yeah.
I think we can, on the outside, it looks like we're giving our best effort in our service to the Lord, but our conscience knows that we can give more.
Okay, wonderful. So today, we can play act, right? As we see many times in the New Testament scriptures, what we call the New Testament, where hypocrites, play actors, play acting is criticized. You're not real. You're play acting like a believer. You're play acting like a Christian. You're not sincere, right? So, oh yeah, my goodness, we can do that today. Probably most of us do frequently. And then we have to catch ourselves and stop it. Yes, ma'am.
I think it's telling us today that God of yesterday is still the same God today, and although he was working through the apostles, he knows our heart.
Okay.
He knows whether we're honest or not.
So God knows our heart. He knows if we're honest or not. We can't
That's
fool
right.
God,
That's
right?
right.
We can fool ourselves, maybe, by rationalizing in our own minds, sometimes. We can easily fool other people if we're good hypocrites, if we're good play actors. We can do that. But you can't fool God, can you? He knows the heart. Okay, wonderful. So those sound good to me. Anybody else? What do you think else? Anything else that pops in your mind?
One thing I find interesting in this is that when we refer to Ananias, it doesn't say that he lied. It doesn't say that he misrepresented. It just said that he laid down, he kept that part of it and laid the rest of it
Yeah.
down. You've got to do a little reading between the lines here.
That's
And
right.
When you read about Sapphira, then it says that she lied. Then the whole picture becomes more clear. So you have to read the whole context to really get the message.
Exactly. And hence the flow. You have to read the flow. See where it's going, where it's been, where it's going, who, what, where, when, why, figure it out.
Which is the message to us that we shouldn't pick out just a few verses and say, well, this is the story. We need to read the whole context. We need to read the whole thing.
Exactly.
And put it all together.
Exactly. And indeed, you can imagine fear and respect came on everybody that heard this. I mean, instantaneously, these people dropped dead and breathed their last. Yes, sir.
It was almost like kind of what you were saying. Sometimes you don't tell the whole story. But it's like he was trying to impress Peter, saying, "Oh, I sold this. Okay, here it is, right here." Well, everybody else around, and whoever was there, said, "Oh, he sold the property. He gave all our money back." But he didn't tell the whole story. But it was like he was trying to impress somebody. Or Peter, yeah, look what I did.
Wonderful.
Right here.
Yeah.
But Peter knew.
And these kind of all tie in, don't they? We can not be a true believer really today. We can play act, we can look like it, but God knows. We got to read the whole flow of the thing because a lot of stuff, just like today, goes without being said. The culture knows it, the people know it. So you don't really have to explicitly say everything because the flow of the context tells you the full story, right? It does sound to me like these guys really want to impress somebody. Peter, the apostles. Here's an interesting thing that I was just thinking about not too long ago, really. Why doesn't God zap everybody today when they sin? Believers in this body. There's Brother Shear comes in and, he leads the prayer, but he doesn't really mean it. He's not really sincere. God knows. How come I don't get instantly down and breathe my last?
Because we have free
Nobody
will.
would be here.
Well, there you go, because nobody would be left, right? Hey, I'd be history. Well, John, the epistles of John, 1 John tells us, look, guys, in fact, this is a sweep of the scripture in many places. If you think or say that you don't sin, you're a numbskull, basically. Now, I'm highly paraphrasing and contextualizing now, right? It says, no, the truth is not in you, in the scriptures, because everybody is a mess. It's the sacrifice of Jesus that compensates for that. Remember when he says, but if you walk in the light, as he is in the light, then you are cleansed. And interestingly, In the Greek, that's a present active indicative verb, which means now, ongoing, continuing. It doesn't stop. It's flowing. There's no stop to that. So I kind of had this silly mental image, like over all of us. There's like a giant invisible waterfall. And we're a mess. But we're trying hard. We believe in Jesus. We say, please help us, please forgive us. We're a mess. But this giant invisible waterfall is like always perpetually cleansing. Okay, got your back. I know you're a mess. That's why I came down and died for you guys, maybe Jesus might say. Always a mess. Well, then why weren't these guys covered by the sacrifice of Jesus and they were given another chance? Why were they not given another chance? Just killed. Doesn't that seem a bit odd, inconsistent? Today, I thought believers are covered by the blood of Christ for their messes.
Well, Ephesians 2:20 says that the church is built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets.
That's true.
The apostles had a certain authority that we don't have today. And Ananias and Sapphira go into this act of hypocrisy in the face of Peter. Well, Peter's authority would have been compromised by that point. And really it reminds me of Nadab and Abihu, because this was the transition of the Mosaic covenant, where the law of Moses was coming into effect, and God explicitly said, don't offer strange fire. Nadab and Abihu
That's true.
disobeyed God, they didn't do it by faith, and they did their own thing, and God's out.
You're totally right, yep.
And really, it's an example. It's like, don't do this,
Yep.
or you're condemned. And Ananias and Sapphira didn't do this by faith.
Exactly. So Sean says, hey, it's like Nadab and Abihu, right? They were commanded to do this in so way. They did strange fire. But let me push back on you a little bit. That was under the Mosaic covenant. They were Levites in charge of the worship assembly, and they were specifically told, do A and B and C. And they decided, forget it. I'm not going to do A and B and C. I'm going to do my own thing. So that's super severe. I look at it. Now, but we don't know Ananias and Sapphira, right? But in our last 30 seconds, let me pose a possibility to you guys to think about. And feel free to push back on me. How do we know Ananias and Sapphira were not, how do we know they were real believers? How do we know they were not Pharisaic plants to infiltrate this new church and maybe undermine it? Do you remember all through the scriptures we see, beware of sheep that look like sheep, but they're wolves, and they will enter your assemblies. Be aware of that. Watch out for that. Could these two be wolves in sheep clothing, and they're trying to ingratiate themselves, they're trying to impress the people, so all the people will say, hey, Ananias and Sapphira, they're good people. Look at what they did. They're generous, they're wonderful, we need to listen to them. So if they say stuff like, hey, you need to become a full Jew and be circumcised before you can be saved, like we read about problems in the church in Corinth, the church in Antioch of Syria, etc., these Judaizers causing all kinds of trouble. Could that be Ananias and Sapphira? And they weren't really believers? Could it be? Luke doesn't tell us. I wish he would tell me, but he doesn't tell us. But I kind of get this vibe that they're not quite right. They're not quite on board, really, like everybody else. Remember, everybody else had everything in common. Nobody had a need. Everybody else put everybody else's needs above their own. But now Ananias and Sapphira are trying to look good. They're trying to impress. They're trying to hook up with the people so they will look bigger and higher and more holy. Now, why? Is that just what they want to do? We know some people like to do that. You know, some people like to wear a Rolex. Oh, don't be looking at this. This is not no Rolex. And, $5,000 because they want to impress people. Now, I would wear one because it's a cool watch and it's very high quality. I would wear one, but I'm not going to pay $5,000 for it. But if the reason I buy one is to impress people, so the Joneses next door are jealous of my green yard because I use so-and-so lawn service, then something is wrong with me. So I wonder about Ananias and Sapphira. Now that's conjecture. Luke doesn't tell us. But the treatment of Christians, believers at that time, Christian, that name wasn't used yet, but if we're covered by the blood of Christ, then I think, why weren't these two covered by the blood of Christ? If they were not really believers, there is no coverage. In that case, they're infiltrators, they're spies, they're disruptors, which we know from biblical warrant as well as historical warrant that existed back in the day. Okay, we're totally out of time, but if you got like a 3-second.
I was just saying that the reason why God maybe used them as an example is because other people may have been doing it. And he just used them as an example to teach others a lesson as well.
That's true. Powerful lesson regardless, right? Very powerful lesson. God knows your heart. Don't try to look better than you are. Don't be a hypocrite. Be real. If you're not real, keep your money. It's okay. Right? Peter said, keep it. It was yours. Keep it. Do what you want to. No big deal. Just don't be lying about it. Don't be sneaky about it. Don't be a hypocrite about it. And if this crazy conjectural idea that they may have been like undercover plants to disrupt this early church is true, that's a whole horse of another color. Okay, thank you so much. Appreciate you guys. And Tom, I think, is scheduled to be back next week and pick up in probably like the middle-ish, early-ish of chapter 5 and go on from there. Thank you so much.